Hello, everyone. I'll give you a second to get connected to sound. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1240th New Social Environment. I'm Magley, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Diana Al-Hadid and Elizabeth Buhe. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Diana Al-Hadid creates freestanding sculptures, wall-based relief paintings, and works on paper to examine the narrative frameworks that inform human culture. Al-Hadid's solo exhibition at the Eli and Edythe Broad Art Museum at Michigan State University runs between June and December 2025. In fall 2025, she will unveil a monumental site-specific commission for the Princeton University Art Museum's new building. Her work is held by the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the Denver Art Museum, and other institutional collections. And our host today, Elizabeth Buhe, is a widely published critic and art historian based in New York. Her writing addresses expanded modernisms and spatial ontologies in Europe and North America in the 20th and 21st centuries. Elizabeth has taught at the Whitney Museum of American Art and at Fordham University, and is a contributing critic for the Brooklyn Rail and Studio International. And with that, I will hand it over to Elizabeth to get us started.
Thank you so much, Magley. Thank you, Chloe, and thank you, Charlie, for organizing. Diana, it's such a pleasure to be with you here today, speaking about your new show at the Broad Museum in Michigan, which, congratulations, is just installed but not yet open. Um, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but it's in a really cool and interesting architectural building that was designed by Zaha Hadid, which creates a really interesting space in contrast to Diana's work. And the show is a retrospective of about 20 works from the past 20 years that are shown over two galleries. So we will jump into talking about those works and base our conversation around them. And Spun of the Limits of My Lonely Waltz is both the oldest work in the show from 2006, and I know one that is very close to your heart. Diana, we'll talk about it in just a second, but I think this is a good place to start because one of the questions that I wanted to ask you was about when we talked previously, you said that this show felt in some ways like it was a self-portrait, or you were thinking about this show through the lens of self-portraiture, especially as you got to see it being installed. And so I think that's a really nice jumping off point because it will enter us into a lot of the themes that I think we want to address in our conversation today. So is this the first show that feels like that feels like a self-portrait? And whether or not it's the first one, talk us through how it feels like a self-portrait.
Yeah, I guess in a way, probably every show is a sort of a self-portrait or a window into this myself in some ways. But I guess this one feels more so like that because there are actual representations of my image, but also kind of representations of my body in a sense. And it really starts with this piece. So just to explain it, it's called Spun of the Limits of My Lonely Waltz. And I made it almost 20 years ago. Um, it was pretty incredible to see it come back because it hasn't been in the States really in 19 some years since I first made it. It was in a small summer group show in LA. So, I was thinking how odd it is. I don't often feel a lot of feelings around my work. I don't know if that sounds weird, um, but this was a rare moment where I felt, I don't know if it was nostalgia or some, it felt kind of emotional seeing the work again. And and maybe because in some ways I think it's the oldest surviving sculpture. And it just feels very intimate to me. It was made in a really it was made in a flurry. It was I okay, so I'll explain kind of the process of making it. I put paint on the soles of my feet, and I danced the waltz um, in my studio. I was actually at a residency in upstate New York. And wherever my feet, the footprints on the ground, um, kind of became the blueprint for the spires of the cathedral.
Actually,
So
Bagley, sorry to interrupt you, Diana. I wonder if we could see that image while Diana's talking. Thank you. Yep.
yeah, those are the footprints. Um, so it was really made, it's a building, made um, not for a body, but of my body, right? It was made to the proportions of my specific movement, and it was made right side up, and then of course I kind of you can see I cartwheeled it to stand on its spires, and the feet meet are at my eye level. Um, so so the kind of the female, I danced both the male and the female positions, and the female is the nave and the male is the buttresses. And I've just kind of come to see this work as holding um, a lot of the kind of like root themes that kept coming up in my work later. Starting with, I mean, obviously self-portraiture might not seem maybe very obvious to anyone who knows my work, um, but but my work is very handmade. It's very made with really small marks that accumulate. And this piece in particular, it kind of is like one of the kind of core holds one of the core tenets of my practice, which is, movement and motion and fluidity. And for me, it's like, that kind of that concept, I guess, if it's a concept, that practice is really, it's like a way of being. It's like almost a moral imperative, right? There's so much literature now on, on movement as a kind of political agency, because movement is about bodily autonomy, it's about freedom, it's essentially like a form of resistance against hierarchy, against rigidity, against things that are static. So yeah, you can kind of expand a lot from there. I'm later became really interested in, embodied cognition. Coming, this was kind of like in grad school when I learned about George Lakoff and um, metaphor, and how we see the world through metaphor, how we understand the world through these kind of very basic metaphorical concepts that can be traced through our movement in space. So it can be understood by how our body lives and exists in space. Um, so, we can kind of find it in our language, right? Like this piece is essentially the opposite of the phrase like stand your ground, right? Which is like about strength and stability. And and then I, turned it upside down. It's a cathedral, but it's not based on the cross plan. It's a squarish plan, which I learned at the time when I was researching how, all these Gothic cathedrals, that there's one in Spain that was kind of like based on a mosque, like a squarish mosque. I grew up, I was raised a Muslim. So that was really interesting to me, kind of want to let it, be um, I like that kind of that plan, that kind of vertigo, that feeling of weightlessness, let's say. Um, so where was I?
I'd love
Um,
to come back to that idea of motion in a second, but can you
yeah.
talk a little bit through about a little bit through the process of making this work? And I'm curious if like how you get from the footprints on the floor to a three-dimensional version of that. Like, are these actual casts of your feet in some way? Are they
Yeah.
lexical?
Yes, yes, they are. They're casts of my feet. I think you know, I, as it's not it's not, it's very common in a lot of cultures and a lot of religion that like the soles of your feet, are kind of impolite, like you're not supposed to show the bottoms of your feet to anyone, and you're supposed to take off your shoes when you go into a mosque and like any holy space, any spiritual space, is supposed to be very clean and so yeah, I guess I don't know. This was a very intuitive work, I guess. But it was when I made it, it was really with very crude, very simple materials, a lot of and they remain the same materials that I use to today. They're basically, common construction materials that you could find at a, big box store, wood, insulation foam, plaster, fiberglass, metal. So I really painstakingly, when I set the spires down on the footprints and kind of established this, the organizing principle of the piece, I then like carved all of the, it's made out of foam and wood, and carved all of the details by hand. And the only thing that was really cast were the feet. Um, and then I actually burned it, which was kind of risky. Uh, but it was kind of careful. It was controlled flame. But but it was fun to do. It was kind of chaotic. Um, that's kind of how I made it. It's pretty, I mean, in a way, like you can really see the materials. I mean, they're processed and they're transformed, but it was really the I think one of the first works where the surface was much less precious than previous works. Like previous works that I had made at the time, this one really unlocked that sort of surface treatment. It was before I was really sanding and polishing a lot, if you can believe. And still pretty fussy with all of these details, but yeah, it also for me that I'm not a terribly religious person, but I still, a lot of these kind of, I guess, superstitions sort of still exist in me, that the ground is a very sacred space for me, as a sculptor, especially, um, to kind of be in battle or in conflict with the ground has always been like one of my basic, or one of my fundamental, the fundamental kind of like first battleground place is like getting the sculpture to not, battleground is a funny term, to not just like rest politely or comfortably on the ground. So that was, I guess that was one of the things that I really just wanted to try to do, to just kind of like to uproot this structure, and to cathedrals they're these super vast, like these things that are supposed to reach the heavens. They're supposed to reach God. They're like a form of, they're a sort of a babel, right? They're towers. They're supposed to make you feel small, right? They're supposed to make you feel this disproportionate sense of scale and vertigo. And when I did my kind of customary European backpacking tour after college, of course I visited every cathedral in every city. And I had that experience of feeling like extremely overwhelmed. And I think this was a way for me to create intimacy, but like to reclaim this kind of intimacy, but allow it to still be very um, um, kind of off off kilter, I guess. It's funny to see this work in the Broad Museum because Zaha's work is very um, dramatic and very um, asymmetrical and has these like extreme oblique angles and so it was really well suited for this space. Um,
I'm wondering if that dyad that you mentioned of gravity and weightlessness, which I think is present in so much of your work,
mm,
is like, this isn't really the question, but I'm musing out loud if that somehow maps onto the motion and stasis binary or not. And like one of the things that I felt for a long time about your work is that you set out binaries, but like somehow they manage to both always be true, right? Like it's not an either or proposition, it's like a both and proposition.
yeah.
Um, and so let's think a little, I want to think a little bit more about that question of motion because I think that's something you've already talked about, stand your ground. Um, but I think motion is something that often feels gendered as well.
Mhm.
And Magli, can you find for us exactly, you knew where I
Hmm.
was going. Um, can you tell us a little bit about this work, Diana? And I'd like to think specifically too with you about motion here.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up this the word binaries because you know one of the I think one of the things that if I've learned anything in life is that and maybe that Gen Z has taught us is that everything exists on a spectrum, right? Everything really is a gradient and I have such a need to find more nuance in everything and not, not trust binaries. And so I think movement and fluidity is kind of, an essential part of that like philosophy, I guess. It's really about flexibility of mind. It's really more of something that's like it's more psychological. That movement um, and fluidity and these drips and pools and you know depictions of women in motion having agency and in in flight or mid step. Um, those are just very appealing to me, right? And this the story of Gradiva, I came to learn her story. I guess it was several. It was like maybe 6 or 7 years later, in 2012 or 2011. Um, so this story, it comes from the figure, the drawing that you're looking at is of this character Gradiva, it's the title of a small novella by Willem Jensen, at the start of the 19th century. Sorry, the 20th century. It was like 1905, it was very early on. And it became like a source of inspiration for the surrealists. And um, I studied art history in undergrad and was really, really obsessed with the surrealists and Dadaists especially. Um, and Duchamp called Gala his Gradiva. Um, so she's a character that is named after this bas-relief sculpture. And in the story, it tells the story of this archaeologist who is this sort of, stuffy academic, and becomes fixated on this relief sculpture of this woman mid-stride. Gradiva translates into the one who walks. In some translations, it's the woman who walks through walls, which on its own is just such a sculptural, you know, idea that something can start as flat and become dimensional, right? Like that was kind of the setup of the cathedral, was that there was a blueprint on the ground that was extruded to to become dimensional form, right? So anyway, this archaeologist kind of romanticizes this artwork and becomes sort of obsessed with it, and starts to hallucinate that he sees this character Gradiva. So he's in Rome at the time, and starts to imagine her. She's like this, apparition that he sees in the streets of Rome, and he's chasing her and chases her all the way to Pompeii. And there he starts to kind of hallucinate that Vesuvius is about to erupt. So time becomes really like warped, and he's talking to this ghost, and eventually realizes that he's been talking to his childhood crush, this woman Zoe. It's a strange little story. He's basically um, kind of trapped um, in his own I guess academic restraint, I guess. So Freud made this story very popular because he drew out this metaphor. It basically took the story as an allegory of the psychoanalytic process, right? That like it was a sort of analytic excavation that Norbert, the archaeologist, was unearthing layers to kind of reach his subconscious desires, to finally discover what was compelling him, this sexual attraction to his childhood crush. So she's leading him on this discovery, right? She's moving through space. She's this this force. Um, so the story was just really compelling. And then, of course, it had legs, so to speak. Derrida wrote about her, about his interpretation, in Archive Fever, which kind of looks at, it's kind of like it's sort of a heady, hard to, it's a complicated text, but he's basically criticizing Freud for um, for sort of narrowing everything to one specific, you know, origin, a specific scene, that like the act of archiving a memory essentially produces loss, that there's a drive to reduce everything to a memory, to take to create an archive, to basically move something from private to public, brings up this issue of power and who gets to write history. And, is this really about the past, or is it about building a future? Um, it, it it's a really interesting, and I'm also like obsessed with this idea of archiving. It's a very um, it's basically looking at how we create history, right? How we decide on history, on our collective, memories as a society. Um, so 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 later, what I found, another kind of interpretation that I loved, was this um, this man who had only come across in this one interpretation of Derrida's interpretation of Freud. It was Daniel Orell, and he wrote about it kind of like brought highlighted that that Freud and art historians are essentially like compelled by this impossible fantasy of trying to both witness the event and the archive simultaneously, and to kind of basically see her footprint in the ash, right? Because at the end, there's this moment where he sees her leave her footprint, her foot making this impression of the footprint in the ash, and this moment of trying to both like see the memory, capture the memory, and archive it at the same time. So he's kind of drawing out that these traces um, actually is a trace of an absence, not a trace of a presence. It's a really interesting. I kind of got stuck on the story and all of the reinterpretations of the story later on. So she features pretty heavily in my work for, she kind of shows up in sculpture and in panels and in drawings. Because I love that she's not, she's this character that's a figment of a male imagination. And she's always on the move, right? That's her that's her defining characteristic, is that she has one foot on the ground and one foot off the ground. He basically like analyzes the arch of her foot for, many paragraphs, trying to decide if the artist originally was like, making this sculpting this from life or from memory. He's kind of trying to like deconstruct all of this. Anyway, that's her story, and she shows up actually at the same time as I became really fascinated with another character, which I think that we can talk about now or later. I don't know. This other character that is it's a Hans Memling painting of a woman in a basically in a mountain. Um, Kind of, it's called Allegory of Chastity. It's a woman basically wearing a mountain as a skirt. And I love allegories. So it was a really interesting and sort of subconscious pairing that I would show both of these figures together. The first time was at the Vienna Secession. I made two kind of these diaphanous wall works, one of Gradiva in motion and one of the Allegory of Chastity, the woman. She's kind of sitting very politely on top of this mountain. And my contemporary, feminist reading was that she was holding in a volcanic eruption, right? That she wasn't really a victim, but she was kind of in command of her environment. And that volcanic kind of, I don't know, that had a relationship for me to the story of Gradiva and how she lives in in Pompeii both before and after the eruption. So both of those stories, both of those myths, so to speak, are present in this show.
I think it's so interesting that you brought up Derrida and the archive, because there are so many female protagonists who center your work. And there's this way that we could think about your work as like a different kind of archive for the women, or like this logic of the archive as a creative act, a kind of counteract. And you brought up this idea of like, this woman who is always in motion. And it made me think of the ways that we do have different like gendered conceptions around the way people move. And because in the history of art, we do have images of people in motion, right? We have, I was thinking of Etienne Jules Marey, who was he was the inventor of the chronophotograph, which was right after Muybridge did his images of the horses, Malhay was the one who wanted to still the human body moving. And so he put these like white dots and white lines on the side of a man
Mhm.
who he then had walk from, one side of the room to the other side of the room in the 1880s. And the whole idea was to like graph the movement of the object, or in this case, the person. But of course, it's a man, right, who's doing that kind of structured, scientific walking. And it was actually not just a man, it was a soldier. And I was thinking about this before when you said that spun seems like somehow a battleground, like this there's like something interesting about this militaristic language, or the way
Mhm.
in which movement gets coded as militaristic in a masculine realm, or is
Mhm.
something else in a female realm. And I think
It's seductive in a female realm, right? It's like something that men chase after. It's like,
totally, and that's exactly what happens in the story of Godiva, right?
yeah, yeah, that's
Um,
so interesting.
yeah, so
I hadn't thought of it as a militaristic thing, but that's very interesting. Yeah. But see, I think like in men, it kind of shows up as aggression and violence, and for women, it's survival. It's um, movement and maybe, I don't know, fluidity and escape and disturbance and not being kind of pinned to one place and one definition and one existence and one way of being, right? Like I think that's what I really like, just to tie that back into the title, right? That like becoming, unbecoming, those that kind of um, that shift of that stasis is more important than being, right? Like the transition between states is what gives us power, right? That gives us agency. It gives us um, um, yeah,
and like that the word itself is not only one thing, it's both an adjective, like something is unbecoming, it's not attractive, but also it's a verb, like to unbecome. And
right,
there, of course, like we have Simone de Beauvoir talking about one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, and these
right,
concepts around like how womanhood is construed, like it can be oppressive, it
right,
can also be freeing,
right.
and it can be both of those things at the same time. So it's about like stepping into that plethora of perceptions around womanhood that aren't static. And so that to me makes perfect sense with the way that your work wants to always be kind of in that gray space between the binaries. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir was writing as an existentialist, and that's like
Right.
exactly the place where the binary of self and other became so important in the definition of selfhood. Um,
Right.
and so it does seem like a extremely appropriate
Yeah.
title, both for the
Yeah.
kind of feminist dimension of the work, but also for the way that the work kind of constantly moves between concepts on a spectrum.
Yeah.
It feels really productive.
I love that it has, when you're unbecoming, there's like this, it's like it's rude, there's this kind of like, disrespect or something, like you're to be unbecoming. It's like, I mean, how many times were, you or any, women, I mean, I can say for myself, like growing up, you were told that you were too loud, or like I was called a big mouth more than once, like expected to be kind of well behaved and polite and give like defer to men. And this is not it's not specific to my, upbringing as a, Arab Muslim in Ohio. I mean, what's interesting about like being a third culture kid is that you really have like a privileged front row seat to feminism in both um, in two different right cultures, right? So like um, it- this it was very easy to spot, the restrictions that obviously um, e- exist in in the the Arab culture as a woman, but that they're so present and just to kind of like have a different flavor in the American culture, so um I don't know, I bring that up, but I'm just thinking about my feeling or this criticism of being like unbecoming or kind of inappropriate or not polite, not kind of sitting respectfully and holding yourself in and being angry and being loud and rude and kind of breaking those codes. It's anyway, that was just
Yeah, yeah. And also that like the stories, the books we read as children, like that is a way of indoctrinating behavior, right? For little girls or little boys. And I think one of the things that your work does so brilliantly is finds moments in narrative where those conventions get turned upside down, or like you can probe the convention um, through the figures that you find and bring into the work.
Mhm.
Um, Magley,
I
I wonder
use
if
upside downness actually a lot. That piece was, I think it was the first time that it was like that something was fully upside down. But I did have several moments in my work where I would literally turn a thing upside down, turn an image upside down, or turn a geographic map upside down. Or I love to see things from that the wrong point of view, I guess, and see how it upsets our sense of like our proprioceptive sense, but also like our um, psychological sense, I guess.
yeah, I was just asking Magley to find a there was and there was not work because I was curious if this conversation that we're having plays into the diptychs that are in this show. Um, and the way that if we look at a diptych, a work on paper that has two sheets, that
Mhm.
brings to mind the idea of the storybook or two different perspectives. And I know those are newer works for this exhibition, and I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more about that structure.
Yeah, so this is one of the works that MSU very generously commissioned. I made these with Dene. It's a paper making a studio in Brooklyn, and I was their their fellow, their um, I have it somewhere, their lab grant fellow um, last a couple years ago, which meant that they invited me to come like once a month to experiment with this process. And boy, did I take to it. I just loved, it's just weird because I've never really I've never drawn on paper. Like the Gradiva drawing that I showed you or that you saw earlier on was made on Mylar, which is, obviously like a transparent medium. It's like the ground is see-through. And I think I've always wanted to make marks on a ground like that um, because I felt like the marks kind of float on the surface. Um, and I think I couldn't really draw on traditional paper because it felt like the material was like absorbed. It was like some of it was like robbed or something from me. But when I could make a drawing from paper, like out of paper, it felt so sculptural, so natural to the process I make in the studio with the panels. Like this is like cast paper, right? These marks are not sitting on top of the surface. They are embedded. Um, and that just it was just such an exciting way to work. It's also because it's made this really wet process, right? And it's super thin. I mean, it's just like on the verge of non-existing, like the layers of this thin paper. It was just everything I wanted, right? So I was like so excited by this residency and my time at Dieudonné, and I just love being there so much. It was like an addiction. And so Rachel Winter, the curator at MSU, devised a plot where I could make another body of work. And I look at so much I look at so many small paintings, miniatures, right? Not just the Northern European kind of the Flemish primitives, or not these, not just the European medieval tiny paintings, but also Islamic miniatures and Islamic paintings that are extremely tiny and detailed, and like they're something about looking at the smallness of these marks, and getting so close to the artist's hand and getting so close to that like really intimate moment. It's like I just live for that. Um, despite how large scale and gestural and like spatial I think my sculptures and installations are, they really start in this very teeny tiny way. So I can kind of like work on both extremes, both scales. Um, and
Can
and I
you tell
always
us what we're actually looking at in this one?
Yeah, so this is actually the foot of so the this is my foot. As I sat, I was so thinking about manuscripts. Yeah, thank you. So this is kind of like actually two pages. They're butted up against each other like a book. But so what I was thinking about, stories of told by women. So naturally, thought about the Thousand and One Arabian Nights, which is this almost like it's a reference that's almost like impossible to use as an Arab, because it's been so like Disneyfied, like the stories of Aladdin and these kind of like Orientalists, and I don't want to like, I don't know, I don't want to kind of play into that Orientalizing of the, this of my background. Um, I wanted to personalize it, right? So I set up a camera and took a picture of myself. So the Thousand and One Arabian Nights, sorry, just to go back, was told by Shahrazad. And the premise of these stories is that the king, Shahryar, uh, was kind of taking his revenge on womankind because his wife was caught cheating, right? So he, in a rage, decided that he would kill a new bride every night. And Shahrazad kind of stepped up and said, let me be his next wife, and I will save women, I guess. She had a plan. And so her plan uh, was to tell stories that had a cliffhanger every night so that the king needed to hear what was coming, right? So she kind of like extended her life each night. So it's essentially like a way that she rescued herself and all of women through her creative powers, right? And it's such an incredible it's just such an incredible notion, right? That a woman can use her creative energy to do something like that so momentous. Anyway, so I was thinking about those stories, and at first I thought, well, which stories would I want to like, do I want to do like Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves? And there's so many like interesting female characters, like these, she introduces the unreliable narrator, and she introduces, these stories within a stories that these kind of like multiplying narratives that inspired so many other writers, Borges and so many, I mean, really like inspired all of so many, so much literature in the centuries to come. But I realized that I wanted to really make a scene, make it about her, the storyteller, herself, not the stories that she was telling, but set her into the narrative. So anyway, I set up a camera and took a picture of myself, Shahrazad, telling the stories, and then also as Dunyazad, her sister, who was also in the room. It's just a detail that I kind of forgotten that it wasn't just Shahrazad and the king, it was Shahrazad, the king, and her sister. And I kind of was fascinated by the inclusion of this, of her sister in the room because, like to what purpose why was she there? What purpose did she serve? Um, and I thought maybe she's kind of a stand-in for us as the audience, right? So that we're not implicated as the king hearing the stories. We're with her. We're her flesh and blood. So anyway, I was both the listener and the teller, the storyteller. And so you can kind of faintly see myself on the left um, listening, and on the right, telling. And then there's a character in the middle. So it's kind of hard to see. It's all a bit abstracted, but that's my brother, Sam, who was like lounging comfortably on my mom's couch when I went home for Thanksgiving. And I snapped a picture of him, and he looked very regal. So it's kind of like a family scene. Um, and then, the background, initially I had a whole series where I had them kind of set in the king's bedroom, like this kind of opulent in palace interior. And the series just like it just didn't, I mean, read through the whole thing. I mean, like I don't know, 8 or 10, I don't know how many, works. And something was off. They just weren't working, which is really uncomfortable when you're working, with people in a limited time. Um, but they very generously kind of let me come back and rethink the project. And this time I put them in this kind of ethereal landscape. So they were kind of in the stories, and it turned out a lot better, I think, So I do these kind of to blow out. So the images, the line work can be repeated, although it's not identical. But then I do these kind of like washes of just like pools of paper pulp, colorful paper pulp that reticulate and make these incredible textures and create all this depth. And then these so that kind of happens on a horizontal plane, and then the marks are made on a screen on a vertical plane where everything is like dripping. So my work, especially actually my sculptures too, like they're built, they're kind of constructed by drips and pools of material, like pools, a horizontal pool and a vertical drip. It's also really how I put together sculptures. This kind of always like flipping back and forth, laying down and standing up. It's another kind of common way that I think about making pictures or images, and also how I construct spaces, if that makes sense. So that's what this series is. And then Rachel has them hanging at the end of a very narrow gallery where you kind of like walk into the corner, and it's floating. You're kind of like um, surrounded by the stories. Yeah, you might see this. So yeah, at the end of that gallery, there's the pages are kind of in front of you and on your left and right.
This conversation is like making me realize, not for the first time, how so many of these themes are like so tightly woven through each of your individual pieces. Like there's the feminism, motion, narrative. You just mentioned this idea of pooling. And I feel like you can see, like, once you have a kind of vocabulary of the concepts that are operative in your work, it's so much easier to identify them in any single piece. And I wanted to go back to, like, if we think about Spun again for a moment, which is the first work we looked at, and we talked about your footprints and how that gave rise to an upside down cathedral. I think another direction that we could go with the question of motion is performativity, right? And this idea of like not you as a performer, but the direction that motion has taken within art history and performance studies. And I'm curious if we could talk a little bit, and I think this is like a two-part question. I'm thinking both of like Andy Warhol's dance diagrams from 1962, or with these like black and white paintings that were on the floor showing like the steps you would take as someone who wanted to learn how to do the foxtrot or something. Um, and your work isn't didactic like that, but I think there is this element of viewer engagement.
Mhm.
Um, and you do have, Magli, if we can find the untitled work on the floor, like you do have a floor-based work in this show. You also have a large scale smoke screen that you can actually walk through. And it was so interesting. I hadn't known that Gradiva could be, what did you say, translated as walking through, one who walks through
Through
walls.
walls, yeah.
And so my question here is both like, is there something to thinking through the legacy of performance art or the participatory dimension of art? And then
Mm.
also just more straightforwardly to talk about how this work has been installed in these unusually shaped galleries where you don't have like a conventional flat white surface on which to hang things.
Mm.
So I'm curious both to hear about this dimension of participation and performativity, but also simply just the installation and like the work that this Zaha Hadid building is doing for
Mm.
your work.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the show has like a really nice, I'm really glad that this piece is included. It's a weird, yeah, it's like a weird work in my uh my I guess my body of work that it's the only sculpture that is untitled. All of my works on Mylar are untitled. But this is the only sculpture, and I actually like I made it. You can see in the year it was like 2014, but then I kept returning to it. It's actually um, a sculpt. It began as like a sculpted um, mirror, a cast mirror, like a fake mirror, right? Like it wasn't reflecting, but then I cast it in bronze. Well, I actually cast it in coal and wax and froze the wax, so it was really cold. And then I dropped it so that the wax mirror cracked, and then I poured hot wax. So I'm kind of always playing with like hot and cold materials. Um, anyway, so just kind of like this mirror that doesn't work, that's corrupt, that doesn't reflect back, that kind of breaks that. Um, I don't know, breaks that relationship with the self, I guess. You can't really look at yourself. You're looking at the mirror, right? Because it's on the ground. I remember someone had asked if they could hang it on the wall, and I just like couldn't imagine. Um, I just wanted to see the reflection. I was like, no, this is like very much a floor piece. Um, and so, you look at it as an object, and I think you might imagine that you're, um, in a way, like excluded from view, but you're, I think, very aware of your body. But sculpture is, I think, fundamentally performative, right? Because you're sharing the floor with this object. You have to navigate the space. You have to move around it. You have to for me, I look behind, I look up, I look down, I look within, and most of my work, um, maybe not this one piece, but so much of my work, you can see through, right? I don't use, I don't use like transparent materials. The materials I use are typically opaque, but they're, always kind of see through them. Um, it- it's it's rare that I make something. It's not it's not never, but a lot of my large scale installations, all of them, I think you can always see into them. They don't uh, they don't close off space to you. I kind
Mhm.
of hope that they create more space than they take up. Um, and so that piece that you walk through, smoke screen, um, I wanted you to kind of, uh, yeah, be kind of like passing through a plane. Um, because like I don't, even though I make so many works that are like in the tradition of painting that hang on walls, all of those were born from my sculpture practice and from the materials that I use in my sculptures, right? So like the materials are like, it's a, modern day kind of plaster, right? It's like a gypsum, like a polymer gypsum, which is like essentially like a hard, um, not water-based plaster, right? So um, it's a sculpture material, right? It has weight. It has gravitational pull, right? And so I think through um, I don't think with images. Like I don't have a pictorial I don't know, like I'm more compelled by materials and by space and by playing with my hands and experimenting with how things move and flow, much more so than I kind of like have a picture of something in mind. I kind of have to find the thing. And I often start with um, a historic reference or even like an image that I take of something myself, or like a conglomerate. Like this is like a combination of many references that I put together. But and in large part, that's because I have this kind of like, I don't know what to do with a blank page. Like I can't, I need to be making in response to something, right? Like I cannot just conjure up something from absolute nothing. I just, um, I really think through my hands and I find the story as I'm making. Like I don't know a lot of the times where it's going to go or what I'm going to kind of privilege in the work, like sometimes I'm responding to a material opportunity or like a material, something that's opened up in the material as I'm working. I'm like, oh, I could, if I use this, that can I don't know, like it's hard to explain without coming into specific, giving you specifics, and then sometimes I think, oh, this material has allowed for this other narrative to come in. So they're really woven together. Like I don't have this like clear agenda from the start where I'm like, I want this piece to be about this thing, you know. I mean, of course, like with the story of Shahrazad, I knew that was the starting point, but I didn't know. I had so many failures until I figured out what the final image was going to be, and I had so many versions of it. And even as I'm making it, I'm just like finding the colors that I want in the moment. Like it's really hard for me to plan. I know I want X, Y, and Z. Like I start with like everything available, and it's very intuitive. And the same, even for my large scale work, they look like they might have been very carefully mapped out and planned, but I start with something flat and I extrude up and I see where it goes. Like so, if it's not a painting, a historical painting or a Islamic miniature, something that I'm looking at as a reference, trying to connect to an artist from the past. If it's not that, it's something on the ground, like something else that's flat. Um, so it's something in like I start with this kind of flatness and then I push up or push out. Um, what was I going? What were you talking about before that?
I
Uh,
think that finding, discovering the work with your hands makes so much sense, especially in relation to that bronze floor piece that you were describing, because
yeah,
that like imaginary displacement of that work as a mirror from the wall to the floor brings it out of the realm of the visual and into the realm of the tactile, or um,
right.
out of the realm of the aesthetic and into the realm of nature or something like that. And I think that again is that binary that your work is always working to undo, to find a kind of center space where it's both of those things. And as you were talking about the mirror, I was thinking about Narcissus, who, of course, uses a lake as a mirror, but it's not a conventional mirror. And in
Mhm.
order to do that, you have to like, it's quite a participatory thing to lean over a pond, right, in order to see your own reflection.
Risky, yeah.
Well, we have already been talking for an hour, Diana. Is there anything that you would like to, any other thoughts that you would like to leave us with before we turn it back to Maglie and Chloe?
No, nothing comes to mind. I think we talked a lot about everything. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was so wonderful. We have a link in the chat for anyone in the audience who would like to ask Diana or Elizabeth a question. You could submit the question and we will get to you. The first question is from Christina McPhee. Christina says, rescuing all women through her creative powers. Diana, you have such a strong sense of scenes from the late medieval period and embodying the characters. What are the dramatic purposes for each of them? We as the audience are, for example, the sister in the Sherazade story, as you describe it. What do you think it might be about this period that is such a rich source for your work, resonating to a time that is almost like yours, that is almost like your sculptures, actively dripping into our present space?
I mean, the medieval period, I think that's what she's asking. Yeah, I always say that's like my art historical sweet spot. I find that I'm always drawn to this. I don't know, maybe because I was like a gothy kid in high school. Like, I don't know where this obsession with the medieval comes from. Maybe it's because it's like a period that's, supposedly like transitory. Maybe because the relationship between like what was happening in in Europe and the Middle East, is so so different and so rich. It was like the so-called golden age of Islam, right? All these like incredible discoveries and so many innovations that I have like a whole body of work that looks at uh, early Islamic like machinery and inventions and clocks especially. Um, I don't know why. I don't know if it's the tightness in the paintings, if it's that it's so many centuries past that um it but there's such an incredible, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. That's a very good question. I think about it a lot because it does kind of, I mean, from all parts. Like I was really into Sienese painting for a long time, and Northern Italian. All of these really like these the kinds of works where um, you can kind of like see the artist, the painter, having to work within this framework, like this clear, thematic um, prompt. It's an enunciation, it's a visitation, it's a, this these kind of like, biblical um themes, but then you see the artist kind of finding weird ways to personalize it and like and kind of um yeah, that just I just love that. And I also love like how how the religious and the secular are, you know, are kind of like almost equalized. Like there's so many stories um you know that are that I don't know, that come from, these are all myths, right? These are all just stories that we tell ourselves. And you know, some people believe these and some people believe those. I just I find those the way that we create such a hierarchy around these stories that we've created, you know, to that we depend on for our salvation. I find that fascinating, and I'm always interested in how you know, one culture kind of layers over another, and if you like keep pulling back the layers, you can find such kind of common tropes, you know, throughout so many civilizations. So, I mean, and I think it has to have something to do um, with my, you know, that kind of like the old injury of leaving my homeland, right? Like being an immigrant and coming to a foreign land when I was 5, right? Like it, there's always been a curiosity about, you know, my own origin story. You know, like Syria is one of has the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, right? And here I am growing up in, you know, Northeast Ohio, going to these like big shopping malls, these strip malls, and I know that just a second ago I was living among, you know, the oldest part of civil, you know, some of the oldest uh, civilizations. And there will always be this kind of ghost in in my life. So might have something to do with that.
Thank you for that answer, Diana. The next question is from an anonymous audience member, and they're wondering if you can talk about your sense of intuition and how it plays out in the artwork.
Yeah, I mean, it plays out in every sense. I mean, the greatest privilege that an artist has is their right to follow their intuition, right? Like having a studio, it's there's so little that you can control in your life. There's so little really that you can have total authority over. But when you're an artist, no one can tell you no to what you want to make in the studio. It's absolute freedom, right? So it is it is how I've learned to, as difficult as it can be, to notice your instincts and your intuitions in the real world. It is something that I train for in the studio, right? Like I'm constantly like um, trying to hear that feedback internally, like, oh, I like this, but I don't like that, and I try not to question it too much. Like you, if you really, um, you, I think you make your best work when you're responding to that part of you, to where you're responding to the part that is where you indulge those I don't know if that's a good word to use, but let's just go with it. Like when you indulge that that desire, that need, whatever that itch you want to scratch, you know. I tried, there was like a semester where I tried to do the opposite in undergrad. I set up this like thing where I was going to make like really ugly work. Um, and I talked a lot about it, but it was really hard to do. Like it was actually more challenging. I made all these like unicorn, I've never talked about this phase of my life, but it was gnarly. Um yeah, but I remember making this like how do I go counterintuitive how do I, know what I want to do and try to do the opposite, like use the wrong colors, like use the things that are like, um, that are whatever. And it's not just about beauty. It's like there was something else. I remember setting up this experiment for myself, and I just didn't like the work in the end. Like I like talking about that challenge, but you're not going to keep making work if you don't like what you're doing, right? So like you don't have time for it. So um, I really believe that the studio is like it's really like training. It's like it's where you have the right and the privilege to do exactly what you want. Like you are the only one, or I feel I'm the only one that can make the right decision. Like no one else can really tell me what to do. That's an incredible opportunity. I think that's true in any creative field, obviously. That's the fun and the privilege of being an artist of any kind, is that you can finally exercise total freedom. Um, so that's what but yeah, I think it just takes practice and trying to really um you know respond to the things in the world that for one reason or another are pulling you, right? They're sparkly and they're calling you, and you go towards them, but you don't you're not beholden to them, right? You're not just replicating those things. You're internalizing them somehow, and it's very ambiguous. I mean, um, I've had so many times where I have had ideas that feel like they spring out of absolutely nowhere by virtue of me being in the presence of good art, even if it doesn't relate to my work at all. Like I'll be at a concert, or I'll be, at a theater performance or whatever, a comedy show, or, and and um, and out of nowhere will drop on my head an idea that I know happens because I am in this environment where my brain is just excited by the newness of what I'm witnessing in front of me. I am just, their synapses are firing, and somewhere something comes forward because my brain is charged, right? Because you're watching something or you're in the presence of something that's so profound. It can happen in nature too, but that's that instinct, I think. That's that intuition. It's such a fascinating, it's so interesting. Yeah, you live for it, I guess, right? I don't know if that answered that question, but
Thank you so much for that answer. The next question is also from an anonymous audience member. They're wondering what a day in the studio is like for you and if you listen to any music.
oh my God, yes. I listen to so much music. Um, I listen to a lot of music, and I listen to a lot of it's either like talk or it's music. So in the talk category, it's either podcasts, comedy, the news, if I can stomach it. But I do listen to a lot of audiobooks. Um, I do listen to a lot of audiobooks. And And I do listen to music. I listen to music on a repeat a lot. I have periods of life where I will listen to one song for weeks, literally weeks on end. And it really it unlocks like a certain kind of temperament or something where I can just be in a flow. I actually was just saying that um, when I was making that piece fun of the limits of my lonely waltz, I exclusively listened to two songs, which I will tell you now, two very different songs. Um, One had a waltz kind of tempo. It's Elliott Smith's Waltz Number Two. And the other song is Jay-Z and Emil and Ludacris, I think. Can I Get Up? Which I don't know, it was just like very dancey. And I just love that song. And I think I really love duets in music, especially like hip hop duets. That song in particular is like about, kind of like, would you still love me if I couldn't provide these material, things for you? And I'm really obsessed with duets in music, like call and response. And I love remake covers, um, especially. So those are things that that's what I have in the environment. Occasionally, I listen to nothing if I'm trying to problem solve. If I'm writing, I cannot have a sound. I mean, if someone even breathes near me, it disturbs my flow when I'm writing. Um, and if I'm making kind of um, like mechanical decisions or like structural decisions, or I'm thinking through. So there's different kinds of making for me. There's like these kind of like big broad decisions about structure or form or the way things are built and the kind of like those kind of days, I need silence and I need a clear floor. I really can't. I need like a clearing in the studio, and I sit on the ground and I have a big sketchbook. I always work with a sketchbook that's like very like large scale, and I just kind of I write and sketch out kind of it's more like schematics. Um, and then when I'm doing like just a flowy kind of like the paper pulp works or my Mylar works or a panel where I'm just like those are like the more flow things, and that tends to be more music or storytelling. I remember being in fourth grade, and my teacher would tell stories, and we'd have like drawing period, like a period where we just like color or draw, and she would tell stories. And I'm sure that is where that all began because it was my favorite time of day. But yeah, I mean, I sometimes, I usually have at least one person that helps me in my Brooklyn studio. Um, so sometimes I'm just chatting with them, um, but that's not often when I'm kind of like making. That's just kind of like part of my day, which is a big part of my day too. But um, yeah.
We have one last question. If you'll have it, it's from Chloe. I'll let Chloe unmute herself.
Thank you so much, Diana and Elizabeth, for this conversation, which has been such a pleasure to listen to. Um, I was really struck by what you said at the beginning, Diana, about how when you're making your work, you're not like overcome with feeling when you're working on it. And I want to go back to that. I'm curious about how you think about the minutia versus the whole in the work and whether that changes over time. Like when you were looking at Spun of the Limits of My Lonely Waltz, could you see it differently after all this time, not being so close to the minutia and the details, which are so astounding in their volume and in how much of them there is? And like I feel like yeah, it just had to be interesting to be able to look at it from the other side of time, and not see your hand in these very specific small moments across it and be able to look at it as a whole composition. And I'm curious about that feeling.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you asked because I can clarify. Um, I when I say I don't have feelings, it's actually not true in the moment, in the making of the work. I feel normal feelings. But when I see my work again, or when I'm kind of, installing it or seeing a slide of it, or, I don't think about my work in the past. It's so, unless something like this comes up, there are times where I entirely forget about something that I've made. Um, so it's more that like I don't I don't have like an emotional response to seeing my work very often. I just kind of like, I see it and I think I almost don't even like I don't have like opinions where I'm like, yeah, that's a good one. Like, I mean, if I'm honest, I don't really think in those terms. Like, I don't know why. I think it's a different kind of analysis. It's like, um, I mean, yeah, there's probably times where I'm like, okay, that one's not like, when I made the first series for the Shahrazad work with Dieudonné, what I felt was that it wasn't mine. It wasn't right yet. That's like the most I can say is that, there's a lot of work that I don't release from the studio because it doesn't feel ready. It doesn't feel like mine. It doesn't feel resolved. It doesn't feel whatever. I've put off shows because the work isn't ready, or I've maybe kept the show but showed a different work than I had planned. So that happens a lot. But that's like a different feeling. I guess I'm saying like I don't have like an emotive response to seeing my work, but I think this was the first time this piece. I mean, I was like. I was surprised I was like choking back tears. Like I'd never been on that side of my work before. Um, and I'm not saying that to be like, oh, such a great piece. Like I don't know if it was the nostalgia, if it was the intimacy, and actually it did bring me into the smallness of the piece. I remembered every single detail, every little pimple, every little element. Like it was a flood of, and I think that time when I made that piece, I was 24. It's almost 20 years ago. And I was I mean, I was like a year out of grad school. Um, and I was just literally finding my footing, I didn't have my language yet. I had so many ideas. I had so many things that I wanted to do, and I played around and I experimented so much. And there's so many things that I was like, oh, it's kind of cool, but I'm not sure, but nothing survived until that piece, right? So it felt like my first child. It felt like I was like reunited with a part of myself that I had forgotten. And that was very emotional. Um, yeah, I was like, I just want to hug it. Like and it has like such a personality, that piece, like to me. I don't know, maybe it's just how I experience it, but like when I stand in front of it, it just changes shape as you move around it. You feel dizzy looking at it, but it's sort of like it's not as big as I think people think when they see it in the images. It's kind of like shot slightly from low. It's really, I mean, I could almost hug the side, it's not that small. But it just feels very it just has a personality. It feels like it's alive to me somehow. And I don't know. I guess that maybe in another 20 years I'll look at the work that I was doing now and feel that way. But there was something about the rawness and the kind of the solitariness. I mean, it was a lonely time. That's why I called it, I really was at this residency. It was like two other people there in upstate New York. It's this place called Sculpture Space. And it was a very odd time in my life. And all I did was I don't think I slept for the whole time that I made that piece. I don't think I had a real night's sleep more than 5 hours, more than 4 or 5 hours for the entire duration of making that. It was Elliott Smith and Jay-Z round the clock, like just like this really, really like internal experience, very psychological. It's a good time. Anyway.
Thank you so much, Diana. And
Thank
thank you,
you.
Fitz and Diana, for your conversation today. It's been such a pleasure to listen to. Back over.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question, Chloe. Diana, I know you wanted to close out with a reading. Would you still like to do that?
Sure. How much time do we have? Because I feel like we talked a lot, and there were two things that I was thinking about.
We do have 4 minutes.
Let's just do the short one then.
Okay.
I'll just tell you what I was gonna read from because I happen to be reading this text this week, and there was a um a section. It's Trinity Minha, this book here. And there's a section called The Infinite Play of Empty Mirrors. And it made me think of the the untitled sculpture. So if anyone wants to read that on their own, they can. Let me find the shorter one that I pulled up. It's not entirely directly related to, let me see, to the work. Kind of is. It is. It's related, I guess, to me. It's a poem because I know that the tradition is to read a poem. It's by Nizar Qabbani, is a Syrian contemporary poet working in the 60s, 70s. Anyway, so it's called A Lesson in Drawing. My son places his paint box in front of me and asks to draw a bird for him. Into the color gray, I dip the brush and draw a square with locks and bars. Astonishment fills his eyes. But this is a prison, father. Don't you know how to draw a bird? And I tell him, son, forgive me. I've forgotten the shapes of birds. My son puts the drawing book in front of me and asks me to draw a wheat stalk. I hold the pen and draw a gun. My son mocks my ignorance, demanding, don't you know, father, the difference between a wheat stalk and a gun? I tell him, son, once I used to know the shapes of wheat stalks, the shape of the loaf, the shape of the rose. But in this hardened time, the trees of the forest have joined, the militiamen, and the rose wears dull fatigues. In this time of armed wheat stalks, armed birds, armed culture, and armed religion, you can't buy a loaf without finding a gun inside. You can't pluck a rose in the field without its raising its thorns in your face. You can't buy a book that doesn't explode between your fingers. My son sits at the edge of my bed and asks me to recite a poem. A tear falls from my eyes onto the pillow. My son licks it up, astonished, saying, but this is a tear, father, not a poem. And I tell him, when you grow up, my son, and read the Diwan of Arabic poetry, you'll discover that the word and the tear are twins, and the Arabic poem is no more than a tear wept by writing fingers. My son lays down his pens, his crayon box in front of me, and asks me to draw a homeland for him. The brush trembles in my hands, and I sink weeping. That's it.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was so beautiful and such a precious way to close us out. Thank you, Diana and Elizabeth. Thank you to
Thank you
Molly
all.
Mateo from Casman and Rachel and Zoe from MSU for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSC program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And this program concludes the Rail New Social Environment Spring Season. We hope you'll join us throughout this summer in looking back at conversations in our archive. Subscribe to our newsletter to learn more. And we'll see you from September 2nd for more conversations. And as is Rail tradition, you can now all unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you all so much.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for that reading, Diana.
Great reading. Thanks, Diana.
Thanks so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful
Bye,
talk.
guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Good night,
you.
Lee.
Great reading. Bye.
Thank you. Great summer, everyone.
Thank you.
Diana.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great conversation.
Happy last day of school.